Wendy's Honda CB500X is getting some more pampering. The last time it was a rear shock. Today it's a fork upgrade. I've bought the full upgrade kit. There's some spring preload units that go in the top of the forks. Some shorter spaces that make up for the length of the PD valves. And then the PD valves themselves, which change the damping within the forks. The little adapters on the end allow the PD valves to sit down snugly into the damping rods. And finally, there's some new springs. They also have a very small amount of fork oil here too. I don't know what you expected to use that for. Anyway, this is Wendy's bike. It's a 2013 model. And we're going to start the job. First thing is to just loosen off the fork caps so that they're easier to undo once we've got the forks out of the bike. Wendy's bike has been lowered, so I need to just measure how far the forks are up in the triple clamps so I can do the same thing when I reinstall. After finding a decent spot to measure them, I find that 22mm is the measurement, so write it down so I don't forget. Now I'm going to loosen off the bolts in the top of the triple clamp. Before removing the wheel, I find it easiest to just remove the caliper altogether and put it up out of the way. Now I can loosen off the pinch bolt. And then loosen the axle nut before I jack the bike up, ready to take the wheel out. The bike doesn't have a centre stand, so I'm just jacking up on the bottom of the exhaust pipes. There's not that much weight, so nothing gets damaged. Now I can remove the wheel. The mudguard's next. Now with that done, all we have to do is loosen off the bottom triple clamp bolt and the forks just slide right out. It's a very simple job to take these forks out. There's a little bit of dirt and surface rust where the bottom triple clamp hangs onto the fork, so I'm just going to clean that off. Just give it a little bit of a spray with some silicone and then just using a little plastic scourer. The fork comes nice and shiny and clean again. Just out of interest, I'm going to measure the fork oil that comes out. Don't really need to do this, but it's a good way of seeing how dirty the oil is. I've done a quickie change on these forks before, changed the oil, but didn't actually take all the parts out and clean them first. It's been about 30,000 k since I last changed the oil. It's certainly looking dirty again. Anyway, I give the fork a bit of a pump up and down to make sure I get most of the oil out, so I don't get it all over the bench when I start working on it. Okay, I've gotten about 450 ml out. You can see how dirty the oil is. Let me just put some on the end of this screwdriver. You can see all the suspended particles of grot. I've just noticed that the old caps are shorter than the new ones. I'll need to make sure I get the right measurements so that I get the same height of spring and cap and PD valve, etc. when I put everything back together. The damping rod is held in by a single bolt, so I'm just sticking it in the vise with some aluminium jaws so that I don't damage the fork. And then I can put the hex tool in to undo that bolt. These bolts can be really tight. I'm just tapping it in to make sure I've got good purchase. These ones are nice and easy to undo. No problem at all. There's a brass washer still in there, so I have to make sure that it either stays there or I get it out to put it back so that the oil doesn't leak when I put that bolt back in. Anyway, with the bolt out, the damping rod just slides right out. Okay, here's a trick. When I did my NC Honda, I had to drill extra holes in the bottom of the damping rod so that the PD valve worked properly. But these 500X ones have already got 4 holes in them. Well, that'll explain why the instructions didn't tell me to take the damping rod out and drill those extra holes. Oh well, moving right along, let's make sure that these adapters actually fit in the top of the damping rod. And yes, they do. Okay, so that's good. The standard damping setting that the instructions say is 2 turns of the screw once you've loosened off the PD valve so that the spring is just loose. What I found was that out of the box they came already with the 2 turns of pressure on that spring. So I didn't really need to muck around with them. But who's to know unless you check. Okay, here's another issue. The new springs are about 25 mil shorter than the old ones. And the new spacers are shorter as well. Well, that's not going to work. So what I worked out is to use the existing spacers, the washer, the PD valve, and then I get my 25 mil that makes up the difference for the spring. Okay, crisis averted. Let's move on. Right, the manual says 160 millimeters from the top of the oil to the top of the fork. So I'll just write that down so I don't forget it. So I didn't need to take the damping rod out to do this job, but look at the amount of grot that accumulates at the bottom of the fork. I'm pulling both the damping rods out and giving them a good old clean. I've sprayed inside the damping rods and inside the forks as well to make them nice and clean. And then for a final finish, just some paper towel up inside the damping rod itself. Time to reassemble. Damping rod goes back in first. Just pop that down into the hole. And then reinsert the bolt. Easy peasy. Then just tighten that bolt up till it's firm. This isn't really necessary, but I've just used a grabber arm to hang onto the PD valve so that I can gently pop it down on top of the damping rod so that's nicely put in place. I'm putting the standard 10 weight oil back into the forks, and because I'm not measuring volume, I'm measuring height. I'm not too worried about how much oil I put in the container before I start to fill it up. I'm putting about 3/4 of what I think is probably the proper volume, and then giving it a pump up and down to make sure the oil goes down into the damping rod and all the air bubbles are out. The manual calls for 160 ml of air gap for the 500X. So with the tube pushed right down in, I then just add a little bit and measure, add a little bit and measure until I just get oil on the bottom of my ruler. Then the new spring goes in on top of that. Then the old spacer with the big washer, so I needed that extra couple of mil of height. And we can see we've got the same height as was previous. Now I can put the new fork cap on and I'll be finished. The new fork cap allows me to put spring compression on if I need it. I always find this job a bit worrying. You have to press down and then just get the thread started. The threads are very fine and they're aluminium, and it would be easier to get them cross-threaded if you got it wrong. Here's a little trap for young players. I had to make sure that O-ring was seated all the way around. I almost pinched it when I was tightening it up. Lucky. So there you go, the job's done. A very simple job really. I'm not going to bore you with putting it all back together again, it's just the reverse of taking it apart. In my normal brilliant fashion, I didn't video the before effect of what these forks felt like. This is the after effect. They feel much more firm. Before they were very sloppy. The PD valves affect compression damping only, so I'm not sure whether it's the valves themselves or the springs or both that give it that firmer feel now. It's time to take it for a test drive. So I take it on my test course. There's a whole lot of choppy, repaired potholes along this road, like that section there. You can't really see it in the video, but there's a lot of sharp bumps. These are called high-speed bumps because of the speed that the forks are compressed, not the speed that you're travelling. It's these sorts of potholes that have been washed out and have got sharp edges that you notice the biggest difference with the improvement in the compression damping. Previously, hitting this would be a really harsh experience. But the new valves have really smoothed that out. You still feel the bump, of course, but it's nowhere near as harsh. Here's another one of those nasty little potholes. Hitting a low speed bump, in other words more of an undulating bump, the sort of bumps that you get in the corner, like this one here, doesn't feel quite as pogo-y. Next I'll try a little forest road. There's a few sharp gutters to drive through. They feel pretty good. And now for some rocks. Let's give them a bit of a try. In a number of respects this is a fairly unfair test. I'm 100 kilos, Wendy is only 60. But I'm the one doing the testing. As theoretically I've got the experience to be able to tell the difference between the before and after effects. Well, if it was me I'd be adding a bit more spring preload for my weight, but I won't be doing that because Wendy won't need that. But I can certainly feel the difference. I'm nothing like an expert, but let me explain how it feels to me. Let's take a sharp pothole bump. When the wheel falls into it, previously you felt this harsh, sharp bump as the wheel fell into it and then out again. But now, with the damping, it feels like those bumps don't have sharp edges on them anymore. The wheel sort of rolls in and rolls out of them instead. And it's the same with the sharp bump the other way, like a big rock or a ledge. Instead of the wheel hitting a really sharp point, it feels like the wheel hits more of an incline. And so, sure, you still feel the bump, but it's nowhere near as harsh. But the big question is, was the kit worth it? Without putting the old springs back in, I'm just not sure whether the new springs made any difference. Certainly the PD valves did. And it's nice to have that spring preload adjuster on the top of the fork as well. So I think in hindsight, if I'd just bought the PD valves and the spring adjustment, that would have been enough.